Today, I'm going to be covering the 3 types of boundaries from structural family therapy. I'm going to give you lots of examples, and the goal here is for you to walk away knowing the types of boundaries you are encountering or setting and some places that you might be getting stuck. So let's get going. If we haven't met before, I'm Shaneé with Evolve Relational Therapy. I help clients with relationships, so if you need help, please reach out. Let's start by talking a little bit about boundaries in general before we get to the specifics. Boundaries are the invisible forces that shape our lives and our interactions. They tell us what behaviors are allowed, what behaviors are not allowed, and under what context. If we look at this from a more structural point of view, they also tell us who's included in a group, who's excluded from a group, and they say something about relationship dynamics and power balances. The first type of boundary is a rigid boundary. Rigid boundaries are often depicted by drawing a solid line or a solid circle. The idea here is that nothing can penetrate the boundary. There's no room for negotiation or discussion. These type of boundaries often lead to disengagement or a distancing between people or groups. They are often very impactful when it comes to relationships, probably the most impactful of all the boundaries that we'll be discussing today. I often see clients setting these very rigid boundaries to protect themselves or to protect someone they care about, maybe a child or an elderly person who couldn't otherwise care for themselves, from potential exposure to abuse or potential unsafe circumstances. And under this context, these sort of rigid boundaries are really helpful and even necessary just to keep ourselves and others safe. However, most rigid boundaries are distorted, or at least there's a fear behind the boundary that's very distorted. So distorted rigid boundaries originate with fear or lack of influence, something along those lines. There's a lack of safety within the relationship or a lack of trust. And to try and maintain their sense of safety or themselves in the relationship, they set these very strict boundaries. When they set these strict boundaries, the other person in relationship maybe can't comply, or they sense a lack of freedom for themselves and they end up crossing the boundary, and this other person gets even more upset, and so ensues this sort of chaotic cycle or system or way of interacting. For example, let's consider a child who got in trouble at school, who maybe has been hanging out with a new group of friends. When the parent finds out that they got in trouble, they set this very rigid, distorted boundary and say, you are never to see that group of friends ever again. And where the distorted piece comes in is if we take a look at what the parent might be experiencing. Maybe there's a sense of fear that their child's going to continue to get in trouble and they're not going to have a future. That's a really big fear, but telling the child they can never see this friend really doesn't ever protect them or their child from failing at life. And the child in this case might not have any other option. Maybe this person is actually in their class and they wouldn't be able to avoid them at all, and they end up breaking the boundary. Well, the parent could get more upset, maybe implement even greater consequences or a higher, stricter type of boundary. And so you see where these two people end up getting stuck. Let's use infidelity for our next example. Let's say somebody's been cheated on and they are really afraid of that happening again. So when their partner is out and maybe they're just kind of smiling at other people, they're being a little bit too friendly, it really triggers that sort of fear or that sense of lack of safety. So they set this very distorted, rigid boundary and say something like, you are not allowed to go out on your own or talk to other people, something that maybe this person couldn't comply with. And they end up doing it and the other person gets more upset. It could also look like the person agreeing to this because they know how much they've hurt somebody and they really want to help with that sort of fear or insecurity, but they end up not being able to do it. Alternatively, it could look like this person really thinks that if they do the thing that they're not supposed to do, they'll really be having a sense of freedom or autonomy because maybe they feel a little bit controlled or restricted. And so they go and intentionally do some sort of behavior there that increases that sort of control. And I hope you can see here, there are a lot of variables, but the basics are the boundary is not ever serving the purpose and oftentimes makes things worse. Say you're struggling with thoughts of becoming overweight, or if you gain weight, you'll be unattractive, something along those lines. You set this rigid boundary of, I'm never going to eat sugar ever again. Well, eventually you do eat some form of sugar because the boundary was so strict you couldn't not do that. And you feel even more guilty, sense of shame and disgust with yourself. You might even kind of increase the boundary and say, not only am I not eating sugar, but I'm also not doing these things and I'm going to be exercising. If you are setting or encountering these sort of rigid boundaries, you might ask yourself, is it warranted? Is it really keeping me safe? Is it serving its purpose, or is it actually making things much worse? And what can I do to address the situation? The second type of boundary is a diffuse boundary. Diffuse boundaries are depicted by using a very sparse dotted line or circle. Basically, the idea is there's almost no boundary, or it's very flimsy. It changes very easily by situation to situation. There really isn't any sort of foundation to stand upon. Diffuse boundaries sometimes lead to enmeshment or an over-closeness of people or systems, to the extent of sometimes appearing to take on somebody else's feeling or experience as their own. There really isn't a separation there between who they are and who the other person is or what the other person is experiencing. People who set diffuse boundaries often aren't clear on their worth, or they don't really understand their own values. They may even think that they have no ability to create change within their lives. Maybe the system that they're in feels too chaotic, and even if they tried, nothing would come from it. They might also fall into the trap of thinking that setting a clear boundary would lead to them abandoning others or others abandoning them. For example, let's say we have a husband and a wife, and the husband's mother is saying bad things about the wife at a family gathering. The son decides to say nothing, implements this very diffuse boundary because he's really afraid that if he says something, mom's going to get really upset with him. She might start attacking him, calling him names, and she may even kick him out of the family. He really values family and cohesion, so he thinks, I know how to keep us close is by not saying anything. This is probably something he's also learned to do over a long period of time in this family system. Well, the mother is going to be invited to continue this sort of behavior towards the daughter-in-law, and this may even shift into an argument between husband and wife. There's certainly a lot of things that we could talk about in addition to this, but you can see that there's really a fear here also in this sort of example. The son or husband's not quite at the level of being able to see over that fear and identify that setting these sort of clear boundaries would better help everyone understand their role and what's not okay, and would honor this idea or value of family even better. For our next example, let's go back to infidelity. Maybe the person who's really afraid of being cheated on or getting hurt again decides that, I think I'll try doing open relationships. I think that's really what I want to do, and it's going to keep me from getting hurt if I can just learn how to be okay with these sort of behaviors. You can see here, there still is that sort of fear for being hurt, but the way it's handled is almost like they're molding themselves into what the other person wants or experiences, when that really isn't true to who they are and what they value. The same is true for our example of attractiveness and maybe overeating. And this person might say something like, oh, well, you know what? I've tried diets. That didn't work for me. I'm going to embrace body positivity and I'm going to eat whatever I want. Well, this person really isn't clear on their values and what they really want. They're not able to really be true to themselves. And they probably also have been through dieting so many times that they feel like there's nothing that they can do to have any sort of sense of safety or control within themselves. As with rigid boundaries, diffuse boundaries can leave things feeling chaotic. They can cycle in a similar sort of way, and they might even feel very manipulative, especially if you try out something, like an open relationship or just eating whatever you want, and you realize that it's not honoring your values, and then you flip back into a very rigid boundary where you say, okay, I'm never going to do any of this ever at all. And so that can feel really confusing to people who experience you setting these different types of boundaries. So consider too, with diffuse boundaries, are they serving the purpose? Is there something that's occurring that, isn't honoring your values, isn't true to who you are? Are there things that you're really not okay with, but you're experiencing or doing them anyway? Number 3 is clear boundaries. Clear boundaries are represented by a dashed line or circle. The idea here is that some things can come through. There's room for some negotiation, but there's also a foundation in place. There are a lot of considerations when it comes to creating, maintaining good, clear boundaries, and that's going to be for another video. But the basics are clear boundaries include a verbal description of the behavior that you do not want, and then having at least some sort of mental plan for what to do if the other person responds poorly, or what to do if they sort of violate or cross that sort of boundary. If you're not in a safe environment or you feel it would be inappropriate to do so, then you might keep the behavior piece to yourself, not say it verbally, and then just follow through with whatever you need to do to keep yourself safe. Some examples are, Mom, you calling my wife names is not okay. If it continues, we're going to leave dinner early. Another example is touching people's arms or grabbing strangers by the hand while we're out together is not okay. That's crossing the line. And another example, if I notice myself eating more than 3 meals a day or a certain portion size, then I'm going to reach out to somebody for help. Systems resist change, and families or relationships are systems, at least in my mind. And when we set a clear boundary, it is very threatening because it's attempting to change the system, to change the way people are functioning or interacting, and people often respond very poorly to that. So let's take the husband from the second example. If he tries to set a clear boundary with Mom, it's likely that she's going to respond very poorly, and she may even kick him out of the family. Those fears that he had are legitimate, and they'll start to surface at this point. So if you don't have a very clear plan of what to do when things aren't going well, or if somebody oversteps the boundary anyway, then you're going to get sucked right back into that system and the old way of functioning, except for now it's going to be even harder to change the dynamic next time you go in to set the boundary. This is why it's so important for you to have a therapist if you are struggling or in a relationship or a complex relationship where boundaries need to be addressed. So please reach out if you need help. I hope this video was helpful for you. Let me know, leave a comment if there was something I missed or something you want me to consider in a future video. Anyway, until next time, goodbye. I'm never going to eat sugar ever again. Maybe it's the holidays or it's just Tuesday. What you hope to get out of if you're the person somebody set a rigid boundary around, then, good luck to you. That's not gonna go well. Maybe this person decides that they're gonna really embrace body positivity and they're gonna eat whatever they want. Well, really that's not body positivity, but the system's gonna try even harder to correct. The system's gonna try even harder to